July 7, 1968, 11:43 p.m. Frank Lucas stood over Bumpy Johnson's coffin, tears streaming down his face. The king of Harlem was dead. Frank had been Bumpy's driver, his student, his surrogate son for 15 years. But as Frank stared at the man who'd taught him everything about power, respect, and survival, one thought consumed him. Someone has to take his place. What nobody knew that night, what history books won't tell you, is that Frank Lucas had already been planning his empire for months. While Bumpy lay dying in the hospital, Frank was making connections that would revolutionize the drug trade forever. Not with Italian mobsters or local dealers, but with sources 8,000 miles away in the jungles of Vietnam. Within 5 years, Frank Lucas would control 80% of Harlem's heroin trade, smuggle drugs in military coffins, and build a criminal empire worth over $50 million. He'd become so powerful that the Italian mob would try to negotiate with him. So smart that it took the DEA's best detective 20 years to catch him, and so ruthless that he'd kill his own cousin for stealing from him. But here's what makes Frank Lucas different from every other drug kingpin in American history. He didn't just sell drugs. He created a brand, Blue Magic, 100% pure heroin, twice as strong as anything on the street, sold for half the price. It wasn't just a product. It was a revolution. This is the story of how a North Carolina farm boy became America's most powerful drug dealer by doing something nobody else had ever thought of, cutting out the middleman and going straight to the source. To understand Frank Lucas's rise, you need to understand that he learned from the best teacher in the business. 1952. 15-year-old Frank Lucas arrived in Harlem from La Grange, North Carolina, with $7 in his pocket and a burning hatred for anyone who tried to control him. He'd already killed a man back home, shooting a member of the Ku Klux Klan who'd tried to intimidate his family. Frank wasn't running from trouble. He was looking for bigger trouble. Within weeks, Frank was working the numbers racket, collecting bets from businesses across Harlem. He was smart, fearless, and completely loyal to whoever paid him. Those qualities caught the attention of Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy saw something in Frank that reminded him of himself at that age. Intelligence mixed with ruthlessness. Ambition tempered by patience. And most importantly, the understanding that respect in Harlem wasn't bought with fear alone. It was earned through consistency, reliability, and taking care of your community. For 15 years, Frank Lucas served as Bumpy's driver, bodyguard, and most trusted lieutenant. He watched how Bumpy negotiated with Italian mobsters, how he handled police corruption, how he maintained control without unnecessary violence. But most importantly, Frank learned Bumpy's most valuable lesson: the man who controls the supply controls everything. By 1968, Frank had been planning his move for 2 years. He'd seen how the Italian families controlled heroin distribution by maintaining relationships with suppliers in Turkey and France. The Italians bought raw opium, processed it in Marseille, and smuggled it into New York through ports they controlled. Then they cut it, stepped on it, and sold it through networks of dealers who sold it to other dealers who finally got it to users. By the time heroin reached the street, it was maybe 10% pure and cost 10 times what it should have cost. Frank saw the inefficiency. More importantly, he saw the opportunity. While Bumpy was dying, Frank was making friends with soldiers shipping out to Vietnam, not officers, not MPs, regular soldiers who needed money and weren't asking too many questions about side businesses. Vietnam in 1968 was chaos. American soldiers were fighting a war they didn't understand in a country where heroin was cheap, pure, and easy to acquire. The Golden Triangle region of Southeast Asia produced the highest quality opium in the world, and American military planes were flying back to the United States every day. Frank Lucas saw an opportunity that nobody else had noticed. What if you could buy heroin directly from the source and smuggle it back on military transports? The plan required 3 things: contacts in Vietnam who could acquire pure heroin, soldiers willing to smuggle it, and a distribution network in New York that could handle massive quantities. Frank spent months cultivating relationships with soldiers rotating through Vietnam. He identified men who were deep in debt, had families to support, or were simply greedy enough to take risks for money. These weren't career criminals. They were regular American soldiers who saw an opportunity to make enough money to change their lives. But Frank's masterstroke wasn't using soldiers as mules. It was using military coffins as shipping containers. 1969. Frank Lucas made his first trip to Bangkok and then to the Golden Triangle. He wasn't there as a tourist. He was there to meet Richie Roberts, a Chinese Thai drug lord who controlled opium processing operations throughout the region. The meeting took place in a nondescript warehouse outside Bangkok. Rubawat, a small man with intelligent eyes and perfectly manicured hands, listened as Frank explained his proposal. Direct purchase of 100% pure heroin at source prices, shipped to New York through military channels. Rubawat was intrigued but skeptical. American criminals usually worked through European intermediaries. Frank was proposing to eliminate everyone between producer and street-level distributor. "You understand," Rubawat said quietly, "that what you're suggesting requires complete reliability. If one shipment is intercepted, everyone involved faces life imprisonment or death." Frank met his gaze without flinching. "I understand that what I'm suggesting makes us both very rich and gives me the best product on the American market." The first shipment was a test. 10 kilograms of pure heroin hidden in the coffin of a soldier killed in combat. Frank's contacts in the military arranged for the coffin to be routed through specific channels, ensuring it would reach Frank's people at the funeral home he'd arranged to purchase. When the coffin arrived at Lucas Brothers' funeral home in Harlem, Frank and his most trusted associates removed the heroin, processed it minimally to maintain purity, and prepared it for distribution under a brand name that would become legendary on American streets: Blue Magic. Blue Magic wasn't just heroin. It was marketing genius. Frank understood that drug users, like any consumers, responded to branding, quality consistency, and value pricing. Blue Magic was twice as pure as anything else on the market and cost half as much as Italian-supplied heroin. Within 6 months, Blue Magic dominated Harlem's drug trade. Within a year, Frank was supplying dealers throughout New York City. Within 2 years, he was shipping Blue Magic to distributors in Boston, Philadelphia, and Chicago. But Frank's success created a problem he hadn't anticipated. Attention. The Italian families had controlled heroin distribution in New York for decades. They had arrangements with corrupt officials, established territories, and systems for handling competition. Frank Lucas wasn't just competing, he was destroying their business model. 1971. Carmine Galante, acting boss of the Bonanno crime family, requested a meeting with Frank Lucas. The meeting took place at an Italian restaurant in Little Italy, neutral territory where both men could speak freely. Galante, a man whose reputation for violence was legendary even among professional killers, was surprisingly diplomatic. "Frank, you're making good money. We're happy for you. But this Blue Magic thing is hurting our business. Maybe we can work together." Frank listened politely, then shook his head. "Carmine, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not interested in partnerships." "You sure about that? Because partnerships keep people alive in this business." Frank's response would become legendary in criminal circles. He looked Carmine Galante directly in the eye and said, "The only partnership I'm interested in is with my suppliers in Vietnam. Everyone else is competition." The meeting ended cordially, but both men understood what had been communicated. The Italians had offered Frank a place in their system. Frank had refused. Now they were at war. But what Frank had that the Italians didn't was product superiority and price advantage. Blue Magic was so much better than Italian heroin that dealers switched suppliers even knowing it meant conflict with established crime families. By 1972, Frank Lucas controlled an estimated 80% of heroin sales in Harlem and significant market share throughout the Northeast. His organization employed over 200 people, from street-level dealers to international couriers. His net worth exceeded $50 million. Frank had achieved something unprecedented in American organized crime. He'd built an empire without answering to traditional criminal hierarchies. But success made Frank visible, and visibility attracted the attention of Detective Richie Roberts. Richie Roberts was everything Frank Lucas wasn't: white, working class, obsessively honest in a department riddled with corruption. Roberts had built his reputation by refusing bribes that other detectives took routinely. He was so clean that other cops didn't trust him. But Roberts shared one crucial characteristic with Frank: he was absolutely relentless. Roberts had been tracking the Blue Magic distribution network since 1970. He'd noticed that heroin purity in New York had suddenly increased while prices decreased. Someone had found a new supply source, and Roberts was determined to identify them. The investigation required patience that most detectives didn't possess. Roberts spent months documenting drug sales, mapping distribution networks, and following money trails. He couldn't rely on informants because Frank's organization was too tight and too loyal. Instead, Roberts used surveillance, financial analysis, and pattern recognition. He noticed that Blue Magic appeared in different cities simultaneously, suggesting coordinated distribution. He tracked money flowing through businesses that seemed unrelated to drug sales. Most importantly, he identified Frank Lucas as the common connection between seemingly separate operations. For 3 years, Roberts built his case methodically. Every arrest, every seizure, every piece of evidence pointed toward Frank Lucas. But Frank was too smart to be caught through traditional police work. Roberts needed Frank to make a mistake. And in 1975, Frank finally gave him one. November 8, 1975, Madison Square Garden. The fight everyone had been waiting for, Muhammad Ali versus Joe Frazier III. The thriller in Manila was being broadcast live from the Philippines. But the biggest names in sports, entertainment, and organized crime were gathering in New York to watch together. Frank Lucas arrived wearing a full-length chinchilla coat and matching hat, estimated value $100,000. He sat ringside with his wife Julie, surrounded by associates who looked like successful businessmen rather than street criminals. Richie Roberts was watching from the upper deck, using binoculars and a camera with a telephoto lens. He'd been tracking Frank for 5 years, but had never gotten clear photographs of him at public events. As Frank stood to cheer during the fight, Roberts captured dozens of photographs showing Frank's face, his associates, and most importantly, his obvious wealth displayed in front of thousands of witnesses. Those photographs became the foundation of Roberts's case. Frank Lucas had spent decades maintaining a low profile, dressing modestly, driving ordinary cars, and avoiding attention. But the Ali Frazier fight represented a moment of pride and celebration where Frank forgot his own rules. Within days, Roberts had identified most of Frank's key associates through the photographs. Within weeks, he had surveillance teams watching Frank's operations throughout New York. Within months, he had enough evidence to obtain federal warrants. January 28, 1975. 6 a.m. Federal agents simultaneously raided 15 locations connected to Frank Lucas's operation. Frank's house in Harlem. His businesses. His associates' homes, properties where drugs and money were stored. Frank was arrested at his home while having breakfast with his family. He offered no resistance, made no statements, and requested his attorney. But the raids revealed the scope of Frank's empire. Federal agents seized over $250,000 in cash, several kilograms of pure heroin, extensive financial records documenting international drug transactions, and evidence of corruption involving multiple law enforcement officials. Most damaging was a ledger book documenting Frank's payments to corrupt police officers, judges, and federal officials. Frank had kept detailed records of bribes, amounts, and services rendered. Frank Lucas faced federal charges that could have resulted in life imprisonment. His organization was dismantled, his assets seized, his associates facing decades in prison. But Frank had one final card to play: cooperation. Frank's decision to cooperate with federal prosecutors shocked everyone who knew him. For 20 years he'd built his reputation on loyalty and silence. Betraying associates violated everything Frank claimed to believe about honor and respect. But Frank was a pragmatist above all else. He understood that his empire was finished regardless of what he chose. The question was whether he spent the rest of his life in prison, or found a way to minimize his sentence while protecting his family. Frank's cooperation resulted in convictions of corrupt officials throughout New York's criminal justice system. Police officers, judges, prosecutors, and federal agents who'd taken Frank's money were exposed, tried, and imprisoned. The corruption was so extensive that it reached the highest levels of law enforcement. Frank's payments had influenced drug investigations, court proceedings, and federal prosecutions for over a decade. Frank Lucas was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. He served 7 years before being released on parole in 1981. The Blue Magic Empire was finished, but Frank's impact on American drug trafficking was permanent. He'd proven that traditional organized crime families could be bypassed through direct international connections. He'd demonstrated that superior product quality could overcome established territorial arrangements. Most importantly, he'd shown that massive profits could be generated through vertical integration rather than horizontal cooperation. When Frank Lucas was released from prison in 1981, the drug trade had evolved according to principles he'd pioneered. Colombian cartels were using direct supply relationships similar to Frank's Vietnam connections. Crack cocaine was being marketed with brand awareness techniques Frank had developed for Blue Magic. Frank spent his remaining years trying to distance himself from his criminal past. He worked with law enforcement, spoke at schools, and attempted to build legitimate businesses. But Frank Lucas's legacy wasn't redemption or rehabilitation. His legacy was proving that in America, intelligence and innovation could overcome traditional power structures, even in the criminal underworld. Frank Lucas died on May 30, 2019 at age 88. He'd lived longer than most men in his profession, and died surrounded by family rather than enemies. But the empire he'd built in 5 years changed American organized crime forever. He'd shown that the most dangerous criminals weren't the most violent, but the most intelligent. And sometimes intelligence meant turning war into fortune, while the rest of the world was looking elsewhere.